His name will forever remain in history as a symbol of cruelty and indifference to human life. Paul Blobel, hidden among numerous other SS officers, suppressed everyone in his grim art of mass extermination. What he did with people defies any comprehension. But what pushed this man from architects and builders to the role of the main director of the bloodiest scenes of World War II? And how did a man who seemed like an ordinary bureaucrat become the organizer of one of the most terrifying operations of Nazi Germany? Einsatzgruppen. From September 27, 1947 to April 10, 1948, a trial was held in Nuremberg, the Einsatzgruppen trial. 24 people were in the dock. Einsatzgruppen were special structures in the SS and SD, whose task was to carry out Hitler's ethnic cleansing, that is, the extermination of Jews, Gypsies, and other undesirable Untermenschen, as well as the extermination of communists, socialists, partisans, underground fighters, and in general everyone who was even the slightest bit disloyal to the Hitler regime. These units were formed immediately before the start of Nazi Germany's invasion of the USSR in 1941 and numbered about 3,000 fighters, including representatives of the SS, Security Police, and Special Security Service (SD). Einsatzgruppen were divided into 4 main units, groups A, B, C, and D, each operating in a specific territory, following the advancing Wehrmacht units. Their task was to cleanse the occupied territories of everyone considered a threat to the new Nazi order. The Einsatzgruppen operated with terrifying efficiency, using refined tactics of mass shootings and punitive actions against the civilian population. In each of these groups, there were between 500 and 1,000 people, but they could receive reinforcement and assistance from local collaborators of Wehrmacht units. Murders often followed the same scenario. The victims were gathered in a certain place. It could be forests, ravines, quarries, or even central squares of cities, after which they were forced to take off their shoes and clothes so that their clothing and personal belongings would not go to waste. Then they were led in groups to the place of execution and shot. 24 defendants in Nuremberg were the top of the Einsatzgruppen. By the end of the hearings, the sentence was relatively mild. Only 14 people were sentenced to death, and for 10 of them, it was later commuted to imprisonment. But this did not concern Paul Blobel. None of his appeals had any effect, and on June 7, 1951, he was hanged in Landsberg prison. Even the most loyal judges did not wish to pardon this monster. The failed architect. Paul Blobel was an almost average representative of the breed of Nazi enthusiasts. He had no special talents, could not boast of good lineage, and did not reach for the stars in his life. But he had a desire to live well, stand out, and gain at least a little bit of power. Paul was born in Potsdam on August 13, 1894, in a poor family. He grew up in Remscheid, went to school, then worked in the construction field as a bricklayer and carpenter. He even taught these disciplines. Engaging in construction professions, he acquired skills that were later useful for the Nazi machine, namely for creating concentration camps and mass execution sites. His knowledge of construction and architecture played its part in planning operation as well as in creating camp facilities. But the main thing is that work in this field instilled him a notion of precision and order, which he later applied to mass murders. It seemed he wanted to make a career specifically in this field, as in 1912-1913 he tried to study architecture. During the First World War he served in the army, but only rose to the rank of vice sergeant. In the early post-war years, Blobel was unemployed, but nevertheless completed an architecture course at the State School of Construction. The peak of his peaceful career came in 1924 when he opened his own architectural office in the city of Solingen. Before the period of Great Depression, everything was going well, but it finished off Blobel's enterprise. There were no more customers. Unemployed again, deprived of what he had achieved, embittered, he was an excellent candidate for the NSDAP and joined the Nazi Party in 1931 and the SS in 1932. And it turned out that it was his vocation. The rise of Nazi to power in 1933 led to immediate rise of Paul Blobel, who had been unremarkable until then. In 1933-1935, he was one of the employees of the city administration in Solingen. Considering the long period of unemployment, this was quite an improvement, but in 1935, Blobel joined the SD, and there he found true success. Before completing his service, he rose to the rank of SS Standartenführer, which corresponds to the army rank of colonel. After joining the SD, security service, Blobel established himself as an efficient and loyal employee of the Nazi regime. Soon he began participating in organizing raids against political opponents and racial enemies of the Reich. His promotion at work was also facilitated by the absence of moral barriers. Blobel was distinguished by cruelty and initiative which were valued among the SS leadership. He participated in the suppression of opposition movements in anti-Semitic actions such as pogroms and confiscation of Jewish property. It was at this time that he demonstrated a willingness to take any measure for the realization of Nazi ideology. The failed architect became the head of the Düsseldorf SD branch, overseeing the confiscation of materials from synagogues in several regions. But the peak of his career was reached after June 22, 1941, when he was appointed to lead Sonderkommando 4A, a structural unit of Einsatzgruppe C, responsible for territories occupied by Army Group South. His unit was involved in mass executions of civilians, mainly Jews, communists and gypsies. The most famous operation of Blobel was the murder of more than 33,000 Jews in Babi Yar, near Kiev, in September 1941. This massacre became one of the largest of all of World War II. Sonderkommando Blobel used the so-called gas vans method, special trucks converted to asphyxiate people with exhaust gases. Blobel also supervised the exhumation and burning of corpses as part of the Operation 1005, when the Nazis tried to cover up their crimes in the occupied territories. Shooting with pleasure. Before World War II, about 50,000 Jews lived in Kiev. With the start of the military actions, many fled the city to the east, deeper into the country. Others went to the front, and the majority of those who remained in the city were planned to be shot by the Nazis. The hunt for Jews began immediately after the Germans took Kiev. Jews were rounded up in the streets and courtyards and were beaten. Sonderkommando 4A had plenty of room to move around. Along with the Jews, gypsies, Soviet workers, their families and the families of communists also joined in the business. Blobel and his men worked themselves to the point of exhaustion. By the beginning of 1942, they had killed more than 60,000 people, including more than 2.5 thousand people near Zhytomyr. In Poltava, over 1.5 thousand people. In Sokol and Lutsk, 617 people, 317 communists and 300 Jews. In the city of Zhytomyr, there were more than 400 people. In Fastov, not far from Kiev, all Jews aged from 12 to 60 were killed. In the tiny Ivankov, in the area of this town, is the famous Lutezh bridgehead, from which the liberation of Kiev was carried out in 1943. There, 166 people were shot. But most of all, Sonderkommando 4A got room to maneuver in Kiev in September 1941. It was them who laid the foundation for the terrible glory of Babi Yar, destroying more than 33,000 people in 2 days. Moreover, children under 3 years old are not included in this number. Babi Yar. The first execution in Babi Yar took place on September 27th. 752 patients of a nearby psychiatric hospital were killed. The Nazis famously considered the mentally ill to be human trash. The incident became a prelude to further mass executions. Notably, the Nazis had previously conducted the so-called T4 program, during which they exterminated the sick and disabled in Germany and Austria. Similar practice was based on the ideology of racial purity. And Babi Yar became the first place in Eastern Europe where this policy was continued on such a scale. Already at the end of September, announcements were posted all over the city stating that all Jews were together on the corner of Melnikova and Doktorivskaya Street on September 29th to bring documents, valuables and warm clothing with them. For disobedience, they threatened with immediate execution. The SS arrested 9 leading rabbis of Kiev and forced them to make a statement. After sanitary processing, Jews and their children will be transported to safe places. The gathering place was named Babi Yar. Babi Yar was chosen by the German command not by chance. The presence of ditches and ravines there made the task easier for the executioners. They did not have to dig deep graves for thousands of corpses. Moreover, the place was quite far from the city center. It was easy to hide from prying eyes, and the shots were inaudible there. The natural formation, a deep ravine, allowed the SS and Einsatzgruppen to quickly and efficiently organize mass executions. Moreover, the Nazis often used natural objects for similar purposes throughout occupied Europe to minimize the effort to cover up the traces of crimes. Subsequently, in 1943, as part of Operation 1005, they began the process of exhuming and burning bodies, trying to erase all evidence of mass killings in Babi Yar. Einsatzgruppe C, reporting on its operation in Kiev up to October 12, 1941, stated the Sonderkommando 4A had reached a total of tens of thousands of executions. These numbers are mind-boggling. This was a real death conveyor. Massacres in Babi Yar continued until the end of the occupation of Kiev in November 1943. They shot hostages, underground fighters and partisans, prisoners of the nearby Sirets concentration camp, Roma and Kurites. In January 10, 1942, about 100 captured sailors of the Dnieper squadron of the Pinsk military flotilla were killed. In February 18, 1943, even participants in the famous death match players of the Kiev football club Dynamo, Nikolai Trushevich and Ivan Kuzmenko and Alexei Klemenko, were killed. Out of the total number of persons designated for execution, 15 people were led each time to the edge of the mass grave, where they were undressed and made to kneel, their faces looking into the grave. The execution squads consisted of Sonderkommando 4A, militia and police. When the people were ready for execution, one of the leaders who were responsible for the firing squad gave the order to shoot. Since they were on their knees, the victims usually fell straight in the mass grave. Testified later, a war criminal, Wilhelm Hermann Paul Blobel. Sonderkommando 4A of Einsatzgruppen C were originally created precisely as death squads. Not every mentally healthy person could endure many hours of execution accompanied by horrific screams of dying people. To command this refined assembly of executioners and sadists could only be a criminal of the highest order, Wilhelm Blobel. The defendant Blobel testified that his execution squads always aimed at the victim's head. If, as he explained, the victim didn't fall, then one of the members of the firing squad approached with a rifle at a distance of 3 steps and shot. The scene of victim watching the bounty hunters approaching with a rifle and shooting him from 3 paces away represents a horror beyond words. Cynicism and indifference of Blobel to the fates of others astonished even the judges participating in the Einsatzgruppen trial. When the executioner of Babi Yar was presented with documentary evidence of his involvement in the murders of 60,000 people, the former SS man cynically stated that his guilt was somewhere around 10–15,000 executions. Alcoholism. Blobel's work did not involve interrogation or torture. It was almost mechanical destruction, shooting at the helpless and unarmed. A sort of Nazi version of spring cleaning. Entire units participated in such cleanups. As a rule, the victims were forced to undress so that the Nazi could take their clothes and valuables. And then they were led in groups to the execution site. Orders were carried out at a terrifying speed. Often it took only a few minutes to destroy groups of hundreds of people. And the bodies were piled on top of each other, creating layers of the dead. True, the work was tiring, for it turned out that the commander of Sonderkommando 4A constantly needed strong drinks to relax. At the beginning of 1942, he was recalled to Germany to recuperate. Nobody really hid the fact that alcoholism was something that needed to be recovered from. Nevertheless, it seems that the overworked Nazi liked his job. There is a witness account of Blobel at the open grave where the victims of a mass shooting were buried. All of them were women. Moreover, they were all naked. This practice of stripping the victims before death was not just a way of robbery, this was part of the policy of humiliation and dehumanization that the Nazi actively implemented. It happened near Vinica in the spring of 1944. The burial was done in winter, the bodies laid relatively briefly, and in the frozen ground they did not decompose. When the burial was uncovered, there was steam, and on the top of the pile of bodies was the corpse of a young girl of rare beauty. So what do you think happened? Blobel immediately joked and aloud regretted that he was not in Vinica back when women were being shot. He would have provided the hot beauty with a few extra days of life. What Blobel was doing at such a grave is not hard to guess. Everything befitted his perverted fantasy. This reflects not only his perverted nature, but also the general mood among the Nazi commanders. For them, execution turned into a kind of entertainment. At the Nuremberg trials, Blobel, like others, tried to portray himself as a follower of orders. But his behavior and numerous testimonies proved that he took pleasure in participating in killings and the humiliation of people. Operation 1005. However, what was Blobel doing in early 1944 near Vinica if he had been sent to get treatment in early 1942? By that time, he had already recovered his health and received a new assignment. At first, the Germans buried the bodies of murdered civilians, both Jews and everyone else, in huge mass graves, using either natural pits, like Babi Yar, or specially dug ditches and pits. Back then, even in concentration camps, crematoria had not yet become widespread enough. However, the piles of corpses, though half buried, were a threat. Firstly, it was, so to speak, bad for the environment, since toxic necrotoxin seeps into the groundwater. Secondly, the Nazis began to think of covering their butts from accusation of war crimes, just in case. And so bodies began to be exhumed and burned en masse. No body, no crime. In March 1942, Paul Blobel received an order from Reinhard Heydrich to carry out Operation 1005. That is, to exhume and destroy bodies from all mass graves in the territory of the USSR in Poland. The execution of the order was somewhat delayed. At the beginning of 1942, Czech underground fighters liquidated Heydrich, but already at the end of the same month, the order was duplicated by the famous Gestapo chief Heinrich Müller, and Blobel got down to business. Thus, he ended up near Vinica, where one of the largest ghettos for Jews existed and accordingly one of the largest mass graves. But before that, Blobel managed to work in the concentration camps of Kelmo, Sobibor, Belzec, Treblinka, and Malý Trostenec. He visited Babi Yar again, organizing the exhumation and burning of both the corpses he himself had laid in the ravine and those added later by others. How was everything done? The Nazis only directed the process while it was carried out by camp's prisoners, or in extreme cases, local collaborators. At the end of the process, both groups were executed. The difference was that the prisoners could be shot by the collaborators, whereas the other group could only be killed by the Germans. For example, teams from the Sirez concentration camp were involved in Babi Yar. In Treblinka, Sobibor, and other places, corpse teams from prisoners not yet utilized were used. Operation 1005 was never completed, and the world learned about the crimes of Nazism. End of the monster. At the end of his career, Paul Blobel managed to fight partisans in Yugoslavia, in the south of Austria, and in the north of Italy. After his recall from the Eastern Front in 1944, Blobel was appointed head of anti-guerrilla operations. These operations included not only the suppression of resistance but also mass reprisals against the civilian population suspected of supporting partisans. His unit showed particular brutality in Italy, where they participated in punitive actions such as the mass killings in Marzabotto, one of the bloodiest massacres of civilians in Italy, where more than 770 people were killed, including women and children. Blobel was arrested by American troops in May 1945, when Nazi Germany capitulated. At interrogation, he tried to hide his involvement in mass killings and actions to destroy the evidence, but numerous documents and eyewitness testimonies completely exposed him. In Nuremberg, he readily admitted his involvement in organizing mass shootings and subsequently concealing these crimes by exhuming and burning the bodies. But one detail disturbed him. Why was he credited with 60,000 kills when he was involved in no more than only 15,000 cases? Well, the court reasonably decided that 15,000 was enough for the gallows and considered the 60,000 cases proven. So the appropriate sentence was passed. To his justification, Wilhelm Blobel added that faith and discipline led him to the gallows. Pathetic attempts to avoid deserved punishment did not help the sadist. The commander of the Sonderkommando 4A, which was part of Einsatzgruppe C, carrying out mass shootings at Babi Yar, was found guilty on all counts. The verdict, death by hanging, was announced on April 10, 1948. For several more years, in fear of death, Blobel was kept in solitary confinement. On June 7, 1951, the court sentence was carried out.